Are you? Okay, are you able to hear? All right, better now? Okay. Welcome everyone to our policy luncheon today. My name is David Gunther. I am Vice President for Government Affairs at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Welcome to our Issues and Ideas luncheon on Let's Build Why Michigan Should Embrace Zoning Reform. Before I begin our program today, I want to acknowledge State Representative Emily Devendorf in the audience joining us today. I know you've got a late night ahead and probably early morning tomorrow. So we appreciate you making time for this in your busy schedule. Over the last 5 years, the average housing price in Michigan has increased by more than $100,000. Rental prices for homes and apartments have also skyrocketed. State and local lawmakers have attempted to tackle the problem through tax breaks and subsidized housing, but the biggest piece of the puzzle that's largely been missing from the conversation is zoning reform. Zoning is land use restrictions placed on private property by the government. These rules limit where and what people can build. It may require larger houses or fewer duplexes and apartments. It may mandate a certain number of parking spots that all properties look similar. Setback limits, other rules related to public safety. Metro Detroit has some of the strictest zoning rules in the country. Across the country, states and local governments have begun to take a second look at zoning reform ideas. Today's panel will discuss what Michigan lawmakers should consider to balance local concerns, private property rights, and housing affordability. And given that I previously recognized Representative Devendorf, let me introduce her colleague, Representative Brian Begole, who has just joined us as well, and Representative Andrew Fink. Donnie Steele, Brad Slaw. Oh, wow. We got a lot of people interested in this topic. So great to have all of you with us today. And in addition to our legislators who are going to have to debate this issue in the coming weeks and months, we have three experts joining us on the topic today. Emily Hamilton on the left is Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research focuses on urban economics and land use policy. Her writing has appeared in outlets including the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times, and she writes an occasional column at Governing. She received her PhD in economics from George Mason University. In the center is Joshua Lunger, a Vice President for Government Affairs at the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce, where he has worked for more than a decade. He also serves on the Kent County Housing Commission. He attended Grand Valley State University and is a veteran of the U.S. Army. And closest to me is Jessica Letaw. Did I get that right? All right, good. Community organizer and activist for housing abundance and affordability in Ann Arbor. She believes in an inclusive process that's welcoming to everyone, and that's how we get there matters just as much as where we're going. Jessica seeks to help people connect the stories of who they are with the stories of where they are to enable agency and empower collective work towards change. The format for today's program is each of our speakers is going to make brief introductory remarks, and then I'll have a series of questions that I'll pose to them in a moderated Q&A format. We'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. If at any point during the program, one of the speakers says something that sparks a question that you want to have, you will have note cards in front of your tables and pens. Please write your question on the note card. We will have one of our staff come through and collect those, and I will get through as many as we can during the time that's available. If we are not able to get to your question during the program, please hang around for a few minutes afterwards if you can, and our experts will be here to handle them one-on-one. So first we will start with Emily.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. So as David said, I study housing policy and the effects of land use regulations across the country. I also do a lot of work with state and local policymakers on identifying opportunities to reduce barriers to building more and less expensive housing. So I can speak to some of the efforts that have been implemented in other places and how those are working out there. As David said, housing affordability is getting worse across the country as a whole. A problem that used to be really restricted to some of the high cost coastal parts of the US is now affecting households across the entire country as rental rates are rising faster than incomes and have been doing so since the 1960s. So, in a time period when so many areas of our standard of living have increased drastically, housing is an exception where dollars just aren't going as far as they used to. And making the leap from renting to home ownership is getting more difficult over time. And an increasing body of research makes clear that local land use regulations are a big part of the problem. These are rules like limits on where and how much multifamily housing can be built, rules banning manufactured housing and other types of relatively low cost types of housing, and rules like minimum lot size requirements that mean that every single new single family house has to sit on a large piece of land. And it's not just the rules on the books that are important barriers to housing construction, it's permitting approval processes that can make it unclear what can be built, where, what will get its needed building permits, and add a lot of time, risk, and uncertainty to the housing construction process. These rules were initially adopted oftentimes with an explicitly exclusionary intent to make it so that people of a certain income simply wouldn't be able to afford to live in a specific neighborhood or locality because of the very high price on the floor of housing in those neighborhoods or localities that these rules caused. And localities get their authority to implement land use regulations and these permit approval processes from their states. Localities have no constitutionally recognized authority to regulate land or anything else. So, in my view, there's a really important role for state policymakers to play in limiting the extent of this authority, particularly because rules implemented in one locality have effects that spill across their region. So, when locality after locality adopts rules that make it difficult to build housing or artificially raise the cost of building housing, it can cause region-wide and statewide problems. And we are seeing state policymakers in different parts of the country, in different types of states, red, blue, and purple states, implementing new laws that are intended to make it feasible to build more housing less expensively. We've seen the most innovation on the West Coast, in part because they've had the longest lasting housing affordability crisis. But just last year, Montana, for example, became the first red state to pass a big and wide-reaching housing package. And the area where we've seen the most experimentation at the state level is in legalizing accessory dwelling units. These are a secondary unit at the site of a single family house. And I think this is a politically feasible place for a lot of state policymakers to start because so many homeowners can see themselves wanting to add one of these units at their property, perhaps not today, but at some point in the future. But there are many areas where we're seeing state policymakers taking an interest and taking action to make it possible to build more housing at lower prices, including addressing barriers in the permit approval process, rules like parking requirements that drive up the cost of building housing, aesthetic mandates, and minimum lot size requirements, and more. So thanks so much and look forward to our discussion.
All right, thank you. So I've been involved with housing probably at the Grand Rapids Chamber for the last 6 or so years. Maybe 3 years ago, I started partnering with the Home Builders Association, MML, and Housing North, and we formed a coalition called Housing Michigan, which was successful in passing a number of bipartisan bills. And as we've kind of looked to the implementation of those bills, we've started talking about what's next. And I think a lot of us, especially us on the more the business side, we've said zoning reform is absolutely essential, both at the local and state level, if we're ever going to hit our targets. I've, as much as it's a good place to start, I also realize that talking about zoning reform gets very political very fast. And so while we're working on this legislation, trying to be thoughtful, there's a number of other things I wanted to share with you. When we, especially at the regional level, so the Grand Rapids Chamber Foundation worked to expand Housing Next, which is a program which had started in Ottawa County and is supported by both philanthropy and business investors, which really leads with technical assistance around zoning reforms, helping identify where we can remove barriers, but also how do we get projects going or maybe overcome some obstacles that have been super successful. And we love with data. Ottawa and Kent County, just the two counties on the west side of the state, need 50,000 units by 2027. We are the fastest growing by both percentage and number of households part of this country, and probably, or the state, I'm sorry, and probably one of the only places anticipated to grow in the next 10 years. Including in that, we're also growing overall households. So the average household size has dropped significantly. I think it used to be over 3.5, and I want to say, I don't have all the 300-page report in front of me. We're closer to 2.5 now, and that type of household needs a different housing product. Our research says that a majority of our two counties' population want to live in walkable, amenity-rich neighborhoods. It is illegal to build that type of housing in about 99% of West Michigan. And so we have an incredible mismatch between what people want and what we've allowed to be constructed. And not to mention, we're also fighting over scarce resources. And so as people move in, or as households maybe leave, you leave your parents' basement or whatever, we're having more and more competition for fewer and fewer households because we're underproducing every year. And that's starting to see one of our competitive advantages in West Michigan was we had great, highly desirable places to live. I bought my home 6 or 7 years ago, and for $130,000 in a nice neighborhood in Grand Rapids, and I could sell it for 3 times that right now. And that is not sustainable. If we want to plan for our future, we need to do something about it. Malcolm Gladwell, a famous author, was just in Grand Rapids, and one of the things I loved he said was, if you're not planning for your housing future as a community, you're committing economic suicide. So this is a great topic because it has a little bit of something for everyone. I also want to note before I'll be quiet. We just had an event with Housing Next did with the American Enterprise Institute housing expert at Pinto and one of GVSU's economists, Dr. Paul Isley. And Ed was pointing out they did research on 500 plus counties across the country. There, in almost every instance, there's a direct relationship that can be shown in data on a map, on a chart, between density that's allowable in a county and the affordability of the housing. There's also a direct relationship between density and what's allowable in a community and homelessness. And so if you care about any of these things, we need to get serious and a lot more aggressive about what we're going to do to reform zoning in Michigan.
Yeah. Josh, I appreciate that about the time you got your home is about the time you got involved in housing advocacy. We didn't miss that over there. So I am here from Ann Arbor. I'm an on-the-ground activist for housing affordability, housing abundance, and housing justice, which takes a lot of different forms. I lead a community organizing group called Ann Arbor Housing for All. I'm on our Downtown Development Authority board. I am co-host of a local policy and politics podcast called Ann Arbor AF. And if you're a parent, that stands for Ann Arbor as fun. And what I'm saying is I try to get at housing conversation and leave us change in a lot of different ways. I feel like Ann Arbor is an amazing case study for why zoning isn't the most that you can do, but it's one of the least things you can do because we're getting a lot of things right, and we are still one of the most unaffordable, and exclusive communities in the entire state. We have created and implemented, or in the process of implementing, a transit corridor. We've expanded our accessory dwelling unit ordinance. We applied and then removed inclusionary zoning because we found that it actually prohibited the created or inhibited the creation of housing. We've removed parking minimums across the city. We've improved, expanded, and refined our home occupation ordinance, and on and on and on. And our average home price is over $500,000. It's still rising. So, like voting, zoning is not the most you can do, but it's the least you can do. It's a place to start. I do focus on the local level when it comes to housing because that's where a lot of the levers of change are. Not so much for funding, which is mostly at the federal level, to a lesser extent the state, but because city council makes the decisions when it comes to what is allowed to go where. And so getting our communities involved, informed, and effectively engaged has been a really high priority for me. And that's kind of what I'm bringing into this room. You know, you have both noted that these conversations, not just around zoning, but around housing in general, are some of our most toxic public discourse. I have equated it, sometimes people think this is a joke, and I don't mean it this way. It's a taboo sometimes on a level with bestiality. We do not like talking about development. And I think we have to get better at it as communities and as a state if we're going to start making a difference. One of the projects that I'm involved with right now is community engagement for an affordable housing project in downtown Ann Arbor. Excuse me, one of the frameworks that we're using for that is what my business partner and I called Reckoning, Remembering, Reimagining. And the idea is that we are bringing an affordable housing project back to what is now a deeply gentrified and high value place in the city, but it was formerly a majority Black business district and neighborhood. And there's a tension there, right, of bringing what it will likely be a largely majority minority housing project back into what used to be their neighborhood. And so for us, what we feel like we have to do first is reckon with the history of the community that we're coming into, honestly, and look the repairs that are needed in the eye and the reasons for them. Remembering the shoulders that we're standing on, the folks that have already done work in these communities that we're building off of, because we're never walking into a blank slate. And then reimagining, how are we bringing people into a conversation together, even if we're coming at it with different values and different ideas about what we see for our individual futures. How can we talk as a community about what we'd like to see together? Single family zoning, I brought some of my housing library here, arbitrary lines, fixer upper, and just action. And all of these are really valuable resources. We'd like to think about what can we actually do in terms of rectifying zoning. And all of them have something to do with reckoning with our history. One of them specific, or at least one of them specifically calls out just action. The often frequently racist overtones of single family zoning. It was created to create division, and especially its early promotion was specifically to create segregated neighborhoods that we see today. So when we enforce single family zoning, what we're enforcing is that status quo. So it's important to be able to convene these conversations in kind of an open way. So I'll move on to the conversation, but in terms of what the state can do, set benchmarks for housing that are regionally appropriate, because what Traverse City needs, what Flint needs, what Grand Rapids needs is not what Ann Arbor needs, or Detroit, or Bay City. Help us understand how we can bring agencies into cooperation with each other. If we gave MDOT housing goals, I think we might see some movement on reducing things like vehicle miles traveled across the state. Help us understand regionally how we can talk about zoning, because zoning in Ann Arbor absolutely affects Ypsilanti and Belleville and Detroit, and the same is true for all other regions in the state. So there are ways that you can provide resources, forums, and conversations for interagency and intermunicipality conversation and cooperation that's difficult for us to be able to take place at the local level.
All right. Brought a few questions. I think you hit a lot of the basics of zoning in your talk and your introductory remarks. Why does zoning persist? I think we had the conversation about the origins of zoning, which Jessica, you brought up. Why do you think it's continues to be such an integral part of our housing policy?
Well, I think I'll start off here. Change is hard. I think there's a fear mentality when it comes to changing. I think both of you highlighted the emotional level of discussions when you talk about changing, when you talk about development. It's toxic. Um, I have an example that just happened yesterday. Unfortunately, we had a developer in West Michigan who wanted to reimagine a golf course that can be 400 homes. The 400 homes by right they're able to do it. They wanted to do something that's more walkable amenity neighborhood with a community center, splash pads, and built 538 homes, and then allowed a mix of different housing types. When I looked at the project, I was like, by every measure you could look at this objectively, it's a better project. We even helped connect a really good campaign plan for the because it got put on the ballot by the NIMBYs after the township board approved it, and it still went down 70-30. And that's because it's really hard to motivate someone who maybe isn't operating out of that fear of change, that fear mentality, to show up. So when you're talking about a zoning change, and we've done it a couple times, we went through it in Grand Rapids, we're doing some more right now on other cities. You are going to come up against, in many cases, come up against a very fear-driven level of opposition. And when you start talking about public hearings, the people that are showing up are going to be often very few number, but very outspoken, very motivated, and it's very challenging. I'm sure you've got some insight on this. Very challenging to get the kind of your more average citizen to take an interest in it because they've got 1,000 other things going on. Why do they care if you go from 2 stories to 3? People that are upset, they're going to show up every time. And it is you really have to have your game plan down, almost campaign plan down before you approach it, because it's going to be a fight every single time.
One of the challenges is that zoning effects are acute, and the way to combat it is diffuse, right? So if you change the zoning of a site or a neighborhood or a district, that affects the people in that site, neighborhood, or district, and to a lesser extent, the rest of the city. It is much easier to organize around a kind of against that change. And when you're talking about fear-based, that's 100% true. And so often that manifests as anger and like fairly vitriolic anger. And it's a lot easier to organize around that and a lot harder to organize around the diffuse benefits that zoning could bring. I also want to highlight that a lot of folks kind of assume that what we have is what we've always had. People assume that the built environment that we have is just kind of as inevitable as the Rockies, and there's not a lot that we can do to change it. And I think part of what there's a misunderstanding around is that we made zoning. We brought zoning into this world. We could take it out.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jess and Josh. I just add that in addition to this challenge of status quo bias, where people are often really resistant to accept change in their own neighborhoods, there's also just a lot of policies that are on the books that were not put there sometimes with a lot of thought. With parking requirements, for example, localities often just copy what another locality might have had, or some type of nationally created guidelines that are available rather than really thinking about how much parking makes sense in any given spot. So kind of shining a light on this from a level that's larger geographically than an immediate neighborhood, I think can bring some reason to the topic, as well as drawing attention to the society-wide problems that are caused by fear-based policies being implemented in neighborhood after neighborhood in terms of today's young renters being able to afford housing, or tomorrow's children moving into an even more difficult housing market than what we see today.
What estimates do any of y'all have as far as how much zoning regulations affecting housing affordability?
It's a very good question. I'm doing some work right now on a project to create a nationwide database on what zoning regulations are that will enable better research to be done. Right now, there's a huge gap in just knowing how these rules vary across the country and what their specifics are. But we can say that their effects are very large. Estimates from a decade ago that are now outdated put the cost of zoning at half of the price of current houses in some of the most expensive parts of the country. And it's certainly grown in the past decade.
I mentioned a little bit what American Enterprise has done in terms of you can see it. I don't have that in front of me. It's a very convoluted graph, so I don't know if I'd be able to interpret it accurately anyways. But to your point, even if you just look at just the land required, if I'm requiring you to buy 4 acres right now and versus a quarter acre, I mean, it's just unapproachable for most people. You immediately, I mean, we're starting in West Michigan, in most communities, we're starting at a point where just because of the land cost of what's required in most communities, you're going to price out a majority of Michigan households from being able to ever afford whatever you build there. And that's before you start talking about height requirements, building requirements, materials, and 1,000 other ways that I think planners and communities have kind of set up obstacles intentionally or unintentionally, or just copying from someone else over the last 50 years.
It's a good question and a complicated one. And I think kind of conversationally, what I hear from advocates in other communities is that a lot of times you don't see directly the benefits of zoning policy or other change. What you see is a less quick growth in property and home prices, which is really hard to get people excited around. You're like, no, it could have been so much worse, and that's another reason that zoning change is hard to advocate around.
I think you've referenced, two of you, Jessica and Josh, live in communities that are seeing very rapid growth in housing prices. And Emily, being in the DC Metro, we don't even need to. Why is building zoning reform important in communities in Michigan that aren't growing?
Oftentimes, to the issue of rules being adopted with perhaps without a lot of consideration about what their unintended consequences might be, we see localities that are very eager to accept any type of investment, having rules on the books that nonetheless make it look like the project that someone has in mind can't be built at the site they would like to build it. So for example, commercial zoning can be really restrictive in terms of just allowing one type of retail development, which might not be what makes sense for an entrepreneur who wants to build something there. And that locality might say, oh, it doesn't matter, we will grant a variance to anyone who comes to us with a new idea. But just having those rules on the book can turn away someone who might take their project elsewhere. And if they do go through that variance process, it will add needless costs to their development.
Nolan Gray's book, Arbitrary Lines, Nolan partnered with a Grand Rapids filmmaker to do a short documentary on this that we had an opportunity to screen at the Better Cities Film Festival a couple weeks ago. And it was specifically on this question, to your point about how zoning doesn't just affect housing, it also affects businesses. The point was to focus on, I think it was upstate New York, a very small community there that was looking at welcoming a new business into the community and could not do it specifically because of the zoning. It would have increased the tax base. It would have provided more shopping and grocery options to the community. And the zoning and the public process around zoning specifically prohibited that. That's part of why.
As a reminder, and particularly for the benefit of the people who joined the room after my introductory remarks, if you have a question sparked by any of the speakers, please write it on a note card. One of our staff will come around, pick those up. I will moderate Q&A starting in just a few minutes. If you have a card that you're ready to turn in, we just hold it up and we'll collect that. So how do we balance what people in the community want for their neighborhood, what people want to do with their property, and what the state needs for development?
It's a hard question. I think what we found is a lot of times NIMBYs might not even actually, I'm going to operate from my assumptions so you can challenge. Might not be, yeah, NIMBY is not my backyard. Might not be operating in their actual best interest. I see it. So I live in a very walkable neighborhood near Aquinas College in Grand Rapids. The only time my neighborhood association seems to really get together is when someone proposes to build something anywhere near us, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be actually in the neighborhood. We're actually, our type of housing product is pretty dense, and so it'd probably be illegal to build anywhere else right now, anyways. But someone tried to put in a small scale kind of between two streets, but not in the neighborhood, rental product, and we are less than a mile from the medical mile, so there's thousands, tens of thousands of jobs within a walking distance or a short drive or a bike, whatever. And someone wanted to build a short 2-story rental. And you would have thought that we were, a small township and someone wanted to build a 60-foot tower in the middle of nowhere, and just door to door organizing. But what I try to look at is, I've become a convert kind of to this more of the urban lifestyle because I'm from a small township, and more stuff that gets built appropriately. Obviously, there needs to be some level of neighborhood input. It's your investment, your life, it's your neighbors, all that. That goes in around my neighborhood, the more likely I'm going to have more bars and taverns to walk to, the more likely I'm going to have more opportunities for new neighbors or more investment. And a lot of times, I mean, even the best project, again, if you were to say, look at some of the stuff objectively, you'd be like, oh, that'll be fine. Nothing will ever happen, whatever. Every single time there's organizations against it. So what I struggle with is we really have to get, and some of it is almost, I call it guerrilla warfare, and that you have to get out and talk to people preemptively. So they get their input, but they're not getting it when they heard about it near the end and they're upset that they haven't been engaged. And so we're trying to find ways to let different groups kind of facilitate their own conversations, but provide the data, the information. A common thing we hear is multifamily leads to more crime. I can show you a ton of research that says that's not necessarily true. In most cases, it's not true at all. It's not, there'll be no per capita difference. But we have to get that to people before that project's announced. And so to take a long circuitous, I guess, way to your question is, you got to be proactive and always be paranoid and do as much on the front end before a project gets leaked and it's got a building on it. That gets scary to people, because once they're in that fear mindset, it's really hard to get people to change their minds. And so I think the way to do it is, if you're going to get all their input, is to have rules that are very clear and consistent, that get community. Again, I think zoning reform is a solution to it, because you have it on the zoning, on the use, and on what it should kind of look like, but establish it very clear and consistent and flexible in terms of, so that when a developer or a community, something is going in, they know what to expect before it's a project, because the project always leads to a negative reaction.
Yeah, I would just add that zoning is not inevitable. It's only about 100 years old in the US, and widespread adoption of rules like single family zoning didn't take off until after World War II. So a lot of the most well-loved parts of the country, including places like downtown Lansing, were built without anything that looks like a contemporary zoning ordinance. They emerged by property owners developing their land as what they thought made sense. And we've swung really far in the opposite direction, where a property owner today has very little choice in what they can build on the land that they own, creating just a totally different environment for building housing at the places where it makes sense.
I want to build a little bit, Josh, off of what you said, which is these conversations can't be transactional. And what I mean is, it can't be just about one development, and it really can't be just about one policy, because the minute that you start your conversation there, you are immediately in the space of good guy, bad guy, right, wrong. You have to go further back. You really, really, really do have to take it back to these community conversations around history and understanding better who you've been, to understand can become. And again, at the state level, I think one of the unique roles that you can play are these intermunicipality, interagency conversations that we can foster. So what if we had, I don't want to put Mission and MDOT in the same room without knowing more about both, but what if we were to have a conversation regionally around housing that wasn't specific to a development or a developer, or even that specifically put zoning reform as a part of the conversation, but just understanding like why do we look the way that we do? Why are highways where they are? Why are homes where they are? And beginning to understand more about that history also lets us know that history was workable. Like all history is change, right? And a lot of times I think we lose, probably not the people in this room because your job is change, but a lot of people lose sight of the fact that every moment we are involved in promoting or inhibiting change. Not that change is inherently good, but it is inevitable. And so how are we participating in that? And so to get at your point, like that's a holy grail question, and there is no holy grail answer, unfortunately. But if we can have more robust community conversations around it, we can get more robust solutions.
Okay, I'm going to call an audible here because I have a stack of great questions from all of you that I can tell you right now, we're not going to get through all of them. But while I get these organized and the best versions of multiple cards on the same thing, I'll throw out one on my script. Why do you think zoning reform has bipartisan agreement and disagreement?
The short answer is because housing affects all of us. And so our cards are going to fall where we are. That's the short answer. The longer answer is where we fall on economic development policy, where we fall on business policy, where we fall on whatever. Like all of our politics are going to inform our housing politics. That's true of the differences, and that's also true of the similarities. There are a lot of reasons, including labor, including environment, including economic development and stabilization, anti-displacement, justice. There are a lot of reasons to create or attend to housing policy, and in particular, and so for us to be mindful of who our constituents are, who our communities are, and what the housing challenges are, because it's not uniform. Like even though we're struggling with affordability everywhere, it actually looks different almost everywhere. And so understanding our communities and our response to it, that's really all of our work. And it's I'm not going to say it's party agnostic, but it is party inclusive.
Yeah, it's really an issue of property rights and regulations that limit what property owners can do with the land that they own. So in a way, it's very coded toward an issue that is often of great interest to those on the right. But these regulations are also causing environmental damage, equity problems, huge affordability concerns that are huge priorities for people on the left. But at the same time, the status quo is in some ways appealing to, let's say, a small c conservative because they prevent change. And we see a lot of support for that small c conservatism from the left and the right.
Okay, I think I've got an order where we'll cover it. I would ask our speakers, because I've got a lot of these, please keep your comments short, and unless you have something that's particularly cogent, maybe we have two of y'all take a particular question. Given that local governments typically have more control over zoning regulations than the state governments do, how can Michigan enable its municipalities to assess and implement zoning?
Part of the reason we haven't introduced legislation yet is because we're trying to work with local governments, or at least the associations, and it's really hard because you start talking about preemption and no matter what the subject is. I think there's some small steps. We've talked about ADUs. We've talked about some things that I think are very approachable and you can target them. I also think in terms of maybe not just telling them what to do, there are some things that could help them. And that includes looking at, again, we just had a referendum that failed in my backyard, basically, in Kent County. Are there ways to inject a better process into the public process? It's probably going to be baby steps, because also people get very defensive of the current process. But could we, one of the ideas I've heard, and I've worked with Rep. Fink a little bit about, and I know he's had some draft legislation about, having someone have to state what actual harm that's occurring to them because of a project. I mean, little things like that over the course of 20 years over the entire state could have a significant impact. But I think it's going to be looking for things like that around the process of public input that would likely not be directly just saying, no, you can't set these kind of rules.
Housing, there was a figure cited earlier, 50,000 housing units needed in Michigan. What are the reasons for the growth and what's the draw to the area?
That's just 2 counties. That's just Kent and Ottawa County. I think Michigan says they're behind. So right now they need 190,000 units. They said Kent and Ottawa has done research. I don't have Muskegon and Allegan have also done the same research. I don't have their numbers in front of me. But Kent and Ottawa needs 50,000 by 2027. It's a very comprehensive report. That is, again, driven largely by population growth, generation of underproduction, especially since the economic recession, where we lost a lot of home builders, lost a lot of developers, lost a lot of investors, and then also that our household sizes are shrinking, and we're seeing you need more houses for the same number of people in some cases. Because people always ask that, how is Michigan shrinking, but we need housing? Well, we're way behind, and our household sizes are shrinking. Is a really short answer for that.
We need the diversity is growing, and so we need more household types for the folks that are here and are going to be coming here, including folks that come as climate refugees. We know that Michigan is going to be the Pleasant Peninsula that more and more people are going to be looking around, right? And so having more and more types of housing here is going to help us welcome these folks.
Does excess zoning in growing areas like Ann Arbor have a negative effect on incentives to build in outlying? Jessica, I'll let you take that as the Ann Arbor resident.
Incentives to build in outlying areas. So I think I'm going to interpret that as not within the municipality, which I'll address in a moment. The first thing that I want to say is I'm well aware that there's a thing called the Arbor Effect, which exists at the very least in construction, realty, design, and development. And if I'm missing a building industry, yeah, that very much exists. And a lot of that has to do with zoning and the development process. It's opaque, it's not replicable. A lot of times it's arbitrary and very, very long. And so that process and the zoning requirements drive Ann Arbor costs up, which do sometimes send developers into those outlying areas, including neighboring municipalities, which drives housing costs up there faster, much faster, I think, than they would naturally, because folks want to build close to like culture hubs, like the multiple theaters in Ann Arbor, all of the restaurants, the retail that's still there. It's harder to make the case for housing at the cost that it requires to produce it when you're not super close to all of these institutions, businesses, when you have to get farther to your kids' schools, things like that. But because it does require those costs to build, absolutely it brings the cost up disproportionately.
Yeah, zooming out from Ann Arbor, it's common across the country that zoning rules basically freeze in amber what's on the ground. So as demand for housing in one location increases, it might be impossible to accommodate that within existing neighborhoods. And so the only place to build is in new subdivisions outside of existing cities, which I think we absolutely need that growth in new subdivisions. But that's the most expensive type of housing that can be built. It's going to often require all new roads, sidewalks, sewers, water, everything to service those neighborhoods. Whereas if we open up some opportunities to accommodate housing within existing neighborhoods and cities, that can all be done at a much more cost-effective way.
In a place like Southeast Michigan, where there are countless small jurisdictions, how can we ensure zoning reform is applied evenly when the temptation is for communities to free ride off the growth in the town next door?
Say it one more time because I want to make sure I'm responding to the right thing.
In a place like Southeast Michigan, where there are countless small jurisdictions, How can we ensure zoning reform applies evenly when the temptation is for communities to free ride off the growth in the town next door?
This is a place where I think statewide benchmarking and goals would really come in handy, because at the moment, zoning and most property rights are legislated at the very local level, and there is almost no incentive to be mindful of the surrounding and contiguous communities and how you think about what you create, incentivize, or disincentivize. So I think having both statewide and regional housing objectives and goals and incentives for reaching those, and sometimes disincentives for not. I don't know how closely you all follow these housing conversations, but there's something called builder's remedy, at least in Massachusetts, California, and maybe other places, which say that if areas don't reach their housing targets, then they are required to allow a developer by right to build at the maximum density possible. So you could potentially get a 300-story development proposed in a neighborhood. So I think until we get to statewide plan and benchmarks, we're not really going to do that well.
The new building code that's proposed for Michigan will likely increase cost per house by $10,000 to $20,000. How do we limit this negative impact on affordability?
Yeah, I think a building codes are the next frontier in housing research, where so far there's been much more attention paid to zoning and other land use regulations, whereas policy analysts have wanted to stay far away from building codes because they do perform some vital safety components of our development that I don't think anyone disputes. But there's absolutely room for analysis of rule by rule in our building codes, seeing where rules are driving up costs that might have no benefits or might have benefits that are much smaller than their costs in terms of the way that the current code requires development to achieve the objectives of the code.
There has been, just piggybacking on that, there has been some states or some cities that have looked at code instead of zoning reform. And I've actually been exploring it. One idea is to move 4 units or even 6 units under the residential code, brings down the cost there. Or looking at, for certain size buildings, multifamily buildings, you do a single staircase in the center. It's been proven to provide the same fire safety. You don't use up the space that you're offered for housing into 2 different stairwells. So, like, again, little tweaks can make a big difference, and especially we know costs are going to keep going up. Construction codes are always going to keep being probably more difficult. So I think it places a higher emphasis on looking at zoning reform for density options to kind of offset some of that growing pressure.
David, just a real quick comment. I do not want to say this in the room, but I have to. We have to make it easier to not own cars, right? Our budgets are not only our housing budgets, it is everything taken together. And a lot of times when people are calculating levels of affordability, they're looking at housing and transportation, right? Because they're intimately connected. Where we live dictates how we get to where we get to. We have to make transit and non-car options easier, because if we could take away the car requirement, it would entirely offset the environmental costs. Thank you for not tomatoing me.
I moved just one of the questions forward based on that. How can zoning land use reform be used to foster population growth in Metro Detroit? Relatedly, what land use options work best to foster transit, walking, biking? Jessica, you can have first.
I called for that one, didn't I?
Yes.
The floor is taking away single family zoning. There's not really a reason to have it anymore. And so just allowing duplexes at the very least by right would really help us get there. But this is where I think building in cooperative goals between housing and transportation, not just transit, but transportation departments is really going to help, because the folks who put together bike lanes and bus lanes and who treat sidewalks as infrastructure and not just amenities are going to be key to helping us understand how to make housing more affordable and how to put housing in more places, especially to Emily's point earlier about how it is so much cheaper to build off of infrastructure that we already have.
I'll add that one thing Housing Next is doing is they're looking at a corridor strategy, so identifying key corridors and some different land uses that would enable it to be more dense in the corridor. It tends to be a lot more possible to get zoning changes in corridors. Last year, they talked about single family. A lot of research has been done. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He came into town for our TDA one time, Chris Linebarger. It talks about how the market wants to deliver a lot more of the inclusive growth that we're looking for, and we can achieve a lot of it just along corridors using existing infrastructure. And that's naturally going to promote more options for whether it's transportation, connection, biking, whatever. If we had tighter, denser corridors using existing infrastructure, it's going to just promote that just because it's going to be more convenient.
I'll let Jessica rest her voice for a couple of minutes. We'll go back to Joshua. What will pro-development and pro-density advocates need to get through their status quo position? What you just saw and experienced in Grand Rapids.
I think one thing we've noticed is we thought we were the awareness of the housing needs in West Michigan over the last 5 years has just gone up tenfold, and that I give Housing Next a ton of credit for that. They've been everywhere getting the information out and having really high quality data, going to the planning commissions, doing all the meetings. But I think as the pressure continues to build, there's going to be a little bit more of a reaction. The pendulum's almost going to kind of be in their direction. The resistance is going to grow. And so we started talking about that we need to get private developers, nonprofit or for-profit, because they both encounter the same issues, to be more proactive, even if it's with my organization, Housing Next, other partners on the front end of every project, to try to get across to them what the maybe the realities of that neighborhood, that community are. It's going to be different in the township than in the central city of Grand Rapids, but get them out and get them talking to people before they announce a project. And I mean, I'm going to beat that a lot today. Once you announce the project, people feel left out, be upset about the change. 90% of the time, I feel like. And so I think we really need to get aggressive on proactive engagement on the front end. And again, some of this, if we have the right zoning in place, you don't have to go through all the public process, right? You know what you can build. It's more certain. You're going to drive more investment that way. And that's kind of why we're trying to drive a focus on the solution is zoning reform, but we got to do both at the same time. We got to be able to keep building things while we're looking at the global picture of zoning reform. So I hope that kind of answered the question. I think it's going to be more intense, more personal going forward at a hyper local level.
Yeah, I'll add some optimism from where I live in Arlington, Virginia. We have a long history in Arlington with the type of corridor development that Josh is talking about, where we've allowed a lot of multifamily housing in small parts of the county. And I think that over time, there is still just plenty of concern about change in Arlington, specifically within single family neighborhoods. But in terms of accepting corridor growth, I think it provides reason for optimism because people who live near those corridors really like what it provides them. It's a great source of tax revenue for the county, and people like being able to have kind of walkable downtowns that they might not live right in, but can benefit from having lots of restaurants, shops, etc., close to their neighborhoods.
Emily, we'll come right back to you. What have other states done as first steps toward zoning reforms?
I mentioned accessory dwelling units because so far 9 states have broadly legalized those across all or the majority of single family houses within their states. So that's been the most widespread one, but there are some options that I think will actually do more to facilitate more and less expensive housing, like legalizing multifamily housing in commercial zones. That's been 3 states have worked on so far. Addressing barriers to manufactured housing, I don't think has been done right yet, but could be a very promising area of statewide reform. And then also looking at some of the process barriers. I did a lot of work that I mentioned in Montana last year, And there, the state passed a very broad new framework of how localities engage in comprehensive planning, with new stricter requirements for these comprehensive plans that are kind of the step before zoning to plan for population growth. And Montana now requires that zoning is actually in line with these lofty objectives that are often found in comp plans, but not implemented in zoning codes. It definitely remains to be seen how that new process will work in Montana, but I think it's a very promising
Uh, I'm not going to get to all the questions. I tried to pick the best versions where they have multiple people, but if I do not happen to get to your cards, my apologies. Our speakers will be able to deal with that personally. So the last two that I have picked: how can Michigan enable regional and policymaker conversations around land use so that municipalities can engage in planning that's sensitive to their surroundings?
So I'll go back to that corridor strategy. To get it started, we started talking with communities around us and talked about the arbitrary lines of no one really knows what we cross in your city, especially along key corridors. How can we get them all to buy in to look at, okay, here's the land use right across the border. Here's what this could look like. If you all adopt a similar plan book, we can go ahead and adopt zoning ordinance for a whole stretch of this aging, usually kind of run down car-centric corridor and say, where does it make sense to maybe do something more residential focused? We found a lot of buy-in that way. I've also found that bringing planners together from different communities helps. A lot of them are doing it already. It seems like one thing that I've noticed over the last couple of years is, especially newer planners, um, they tend to be more pro what we're talking about today. It's the elected officials who are maybe hesitant because of the political ramifications, who they don't want to get out in front of. And so it's having stakeholders from different viewpoints push them together and talk about why it's important to an activist community, a business community, and really say that we're not just going to sit here and let the status quo continue. That gets it started on a better foot going forward.
I think something that we could do is facilitate housing conversations in more non-traditional ways. The AARP has a platform on housing. We definitely need to be hearing more from labor. And so if we can be having more of these intersectional conversations around housing and again, interdepartmental, interagency, I think we'll start to get to more robust, not even buy-in because that assumes that we've got a plan that we're working towards and we're working on that, but more robust understanding of the challenges that we're dealing with, because right now we are not on a level playing field in terms of what we understand our problems to be. So that's one place to start.
All right, and the winner of the last card today: what role, if any, do state and federal subsidies play in sustainable housing?
I think that they play an important role, because no matter what we do on the zoning side, there are always going to be households that struggle to afford an acceptable standard of market rate housing. But it's important to remember that these subsidies are very much affected by local land use regulations. The dollars just cannot go far in places where land use regulations make it so that only expensive types of housing can be built.
To your point, as recently as I think 5 years ago, LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit dollars in Ann Arbor used to go $25 to the dollar, and now it's closer to 5. So it makes a significant difference. That's the Ann Arbor factor. To your question, we can't get to affordability or abundance without state and federal subsidies. We absolutely need them, and I think it's really important for us to remember that new housing is not the only housing. Typically, the most affordable housing that we have is the housing that we already have. And what we need to be doing is facilitating the creation of new housing such that we're stabilizing values around what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which I call the uncool stuff, right? Like it's typically older than 30 years, not as old as historic district housing. It's not super cool, but it tends to be affordable, right? It's in lower profile neighborhoods. It's maybe a housing type that's less desirable. So the subsidies complement those.
Healthy communities need housing at all price points. I think we focus mainly on workforce housing because that was where there was the biggest gap and it needed some tools to try to incentivize it. Hopefully those go to work and hopefully push down and out. But I would say if we're going to have solutions, nothing is easy. So we need to have high tech, we need to have housing TIF, and we need to have a ton of market rate development too. There's no one solution.
All right. Please give a round of applause to all of our speakers today. And to yourselves, because those were some really great questions. Thank you for being here today. This is certainly far from the end of the conversation. Please continue to be in conversation, not just with the Mackinac, but also the neighbors and the people in your own respective communities. We need a lot of work and improvement in housing in Michigan. Have a great afternoon.